Welcome back to Sermon Snippets. We're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5, starting in verse 3 this week. And last week we just barely got a start into this chapter, looking at how we are to go about rebuking an elder and different ways we are to behave in the church as far as confrontation and just relating to other members of the church. And today we're going to get into a very specific passage on how to treat the widows in the church. So let's go ahead and look at these verses. 1 Timothy 5, verse 3. And the Bible here says, "Honor widows that are widows indeed. But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home." Speaking of the children or the nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate trusteth in God, and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth, and these things give in charge, that they may be blameless. But if any provide not for his own, and specially for those of his own household, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works. If she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she had relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work, but the younger widows refuse. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation, because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house. And not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some are already turned aside after Satan. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. This may be the first time you realize that 1 Timothy goes into so much detail on something as oddly specific as how to deal with widows in the church. This is not the most popular passage, and it's normally skipped over. I think we probably read through it and don't give it that much thought, but God goes to great lengths to give us step-by-step instructions of how we deal with even something like the widows in the church and how they are to be treated and why. He even gives us reasons behind all of this. So I want to start out just by thinking about this passage, and the first thing that it shows us is that everything in the church, and likewise everything in our personal lives, should be done decently and in order. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 40 says, "Let all things be done decently and in order." And that verse covers so much ground in our own lives. That's talking about in the church, in our families, in our work, in our relationship with God, in our profession, in our planning for the future, in our day-to-day activities. Everything should be done decently and in order, because God is a God of order. And what this passage shows us is that God cares about the details. He looks at the small things in our life, the day-to-day activities and the administration of His church, and He cares about the details. And He wants us to do things thoughtfully and to think through what we're doing, to do things on purpose, decently and in order. So what was this practical protocol for widows? There's a lot that we could say about this passage, and we can go into all the various views and commentators and their perspectives, but I just want to give a couple points on this passage and break down a couple of the verses and kind of get more of an overview of the passage as a whole, and then we'll step back and take some application from it. But first, this practical protocol for the widows. There was a restriction in verse 9 and 10. So let's read that. It says, "Let not a widow be taken into the number under 80 years old, having been the wife of one man." So first it starts out, it gives this title, "Widows Indeed." And when it says widows indeed, that's to differentiate from the rest of the widows. And so when it says widows indeed, it's specifically talking about the women who were at least 60 years old in the church and who had only one husband. And then it goes on to say that they needed to have a good testimony. That's what verse 10 says. They had to be well reported of for good works, brought up children. It says if she has children, then she was supposed to have brought them up. If she had lodged strangers, if she had washed the saints' feet, relieving the afflicted, diligently following every good work. So that's just a portrait of this type of person, this description of a widow indeed. And God's word sets the standard for how these people should be treated. You might say, well, what's so special about 60 years old? Why is that where the line is drawn? But really the thing that we need to understand is that God's word is what sets the standard for our lives. I was speaking to a coworker a little while back, and he was talking about God's judgment on homosexuals in the Bible and people that were giving into different sins, like homosexuality specifically, I think is the one he was mentioning. And he couldn't understand why God would judge that sin and that he would destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but there was other sins that didn't receive this same amount of judgment. But really what we have to understand is that God makes the rules. God is a God, and he's the one who has the perfect standard of holiness. And so God's word is what lays down the lines, and it gives us the boundaries, and it shows us how we are to live and what we are to do, even in situations like church polity and congregational matters and things like that. God's word has to be the standard for our lives. So we can't read our interpretation into the passage, and we can't run a church the way that we think it should be run. We can't call the shots like that. We have to submit to God's word as the standard. And so God has set up the standard that the widows who are 60 years old and older, who don't have any living relatives around, who having had one husband, and those that have had a good testimony are to be taken care of by the church. They're supposed to be provided for by the church. Now, everyone else was not under the provision of the church in the same way. And God gives several reasons in verses 3 through 8 and then verses 11 through 15. The first reason is that taking care of widows falls first to the children, if there are any children. So verse 4, he says, "But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God." So God says, if there's a widow, a woman who her husband has passed away, but she has children, or even the word can be used to mean grandchildren even, or if she has nephews, nieces, nephews, other younger living relatives, it's first their responsibility to take care of their family member. And so God encourages that. He doesn't want the church to take away from that family relationship and that family responsibility. So that's one reason. Then he says that the focus of younger women should be on their home, and the real emphasis should be on their children. In verse 14, he says, "I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully." So God has thought all of this through, and he says for the younger women, he doesn't want them to become dependent upon the church, because then they will not place maybe the proper emphasis on their home, and God wants them to focus on doing what's best for their family. So maybe remarrying in some cases, and then focusing on their children and raising their young ones to follow the Lord. And really that reminds us of Titus chapter 2 verse 5, which says that the women were to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. And so that is a clear command from God that the women are to be keepers at home. The main priority for the wife and for the mom is to be a keeper at home, not just a keeper of the home, because you can keep the home theoretically and work a side job or be outside of the house or send your kids to a school or something like that. But God doesn't say a keeper of the home. He says a keeper at home, which requires that the mom and the wife be at home. And so that's clearly the emphasis throughout Scripture and the New Testament, that moms should be focused on raising their children, teaching their children, and the emphasis should be on the family. But then he gives some more reasons. He says that provision for the younger widows who are still capable for providing for themselves could produce resentment, resulting in them leaving the faith. So if the church provided for the younger women, the younger widows, who were still capable of meeting their own needs, then that could result in strife and resentment. And eventually they could leave the faith. And that's what he's talking about here in this chapter. And then the last reason he gives is that there was the possibility that the younger women might remarry, and then they would not need the provision of the church because it would be the responsibility of their husband. And it even seems that it's possible that this was to be the ministry of individual families within the church. From verse 16, talking about a man or woman that believeth, and having widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged. So it's possible that this was expected to be a family ministry, where a family would take in a widow and provide for her that way, and that's how the church was able to provide by the families of the church, taking in those widows. But really, we see how God desires things to be done decently and in order, and we see that God has thought through all these scenarios, and he knows what's best for his people, and he is the one ultimately who has the authority to tell us what is right and what's wrong. He sets the standard, and he's the one that makes the rules, and as a church we have to be submitted to follow him. But really, I want to finish up by basically drawing our attention to the fact that God has such compassion for the needy. Really, this entire chapter. He starts out by telling us how to approach an elder or anyone in the church that we want to reprove, or that we need to teach something, or that we want to communicate with. He gives us a court of appeal to anyone in the church. And then he goes into this detailed description of how the church is to take care of the helpless, the widows indeed, that are desolate, that have no one there to take care of them. And his emphasis, of course, is on trusting God and on continuing in the faith and doing good works as a saved individual. But God has such compassion. God's concern for us, even in the worst of scenarios, is really unfathomable. Think about being in that scenario where you have lost all your living relatives, and then to think that God put a chapter for widows in this book. Paul writing to his young son in the faith, this young preacher boy that he's training up, this young pastor, and he spends so many verses instructing him how to take care of the needy. And really, God's word doesn't always tell us what we want to hear, but it always tells us what we need to hear. And it's for us. And it does have the final say, because God knows what will help us. See, God will always be glorified. And he always has our best interest in mind. So I hope coming away from this passage, this unfamiliar passage on dealing with widows in the church, I hope you'll come away with the fact that God will always be glorified, but he has our best interest in mind. And we'll pick up going through the rest of chapter 5 next week.